It's Firearms Friday at the Wyoming State Museum in Cheyenne. I'm Evan Green. I'm the firearms historian here at the museum. And one of my responsibilities in that role is my firm desire not to perpetrate or perpetuate inaccuracy. And we run into some inaccuracies associated with the stories of some of the firearms in the collection. And I'll have a little gossip here, but a kind of an interesting time at the museum. In early December, we had a visitor, Craig Johnson, who's the author of the Longmire series of books about a sheriff in Wyoming set in a mythological county. And there's also a fairly long-running TV show featuring the Sheriff Walt Longmire. So he came in, his last book involved mention of the state archives, which is in the same building as the museum. So he was invited by our new director to come down and we'd give him a tour. So he was interested in what was going on at the archives, interested in our new firearms exhibit. He liked that a lot and said he gets a lot of flack in his books if he gets the guns wrong. So I said, for a small fee, Craig, I'd help you out with that. And I would be glad to help him out with that at no charge, because I share his desire to be accurate when we portray firearms. So the new director, State Parks and Cultural Resources, has a new director. His name is Dave Glenn, and he's a total gun guy, which is good for me and good for firearms generally around the museum. So again, we're going to talk about stories associated with guns in the collection and how those are sometimes inaccurate. One of the collection's curators said, well, you know, everybody wants to feel a family connection to a historic event, and I can certainly understand that. So we kind of came up with this scenario. We start with great-grandfather, right? And he's in the Old West and reads about an interesting event, an interesting occurrence, whether it's the Johnson County invasion or the lynching of the cavalcade. He reads about it or hears about it and, of course, relates that story at family events. So that's great-grandfather. Grandfather assumes that great-grandfather was actually on the scene at the time as an observer of that event, and he tells stories to the family around the campfire or the Thanksgiving table. So father hears these stories, and maybe either great-grandfather or grandfather has elaborated a little bit. You know, my wife says that I never let the facts interfere with telling a good story. Probably true. So anyway, father assumes that great-grandfather was an actual participant in that incident. The son, having heard these generational stories, thinks that grandpa was the main character. Great-grandpa was the main character and handed down the firearm that he used to kill Billy the Kid. So we think that's how it happens. And I think in most cases, those stories are not malicious. We have a firearm in the collection where I think it was intentionally altered to increase collector value. So we're going to look at some guns with stories, and most of these I've done a separate video on, but I kind of wanted to go through this as a group. And a couple of these, 3 of these, are currently on exhibit, but what I have are basically identical firearms. So this one, we have on the exhibit a Winchester model 1894 in .32 special or .32 Winchester centerfire caliber. And it was donated to initially the Wyoming Stockgrowers Association, who turned around and eventually gave it to the museum, along with a letter by a man who claimed he had had the firearm in his possession for over 50 years and that it was used by a guy named Herb Brink to kill Joe Allemond at the Spring Creek raid in Bighorn County in April of 1909. And again, that rifle was in caliber 32 Winchester Special. Brink, based on testimony by Felix Alston, who was the sheriff at the time, used a 25-35. So somebody confused those guns, or maybe Herb Brink got rid of his 25-35 because he knew that cartridge casings would be found at the crime scene and acquired a different Winchester rifle that was in his possession when he was arrested. So again, not malice, maybe just the guy trying to dodge responsibility. Okay, one of the things we run into a lot is, oh, hey, this belonged to Tom Horn. And you probably know that Tom Horn, in the late 19th century, very early 20th century, was a stock detective and basically a serial killer, killing rustlers, accused rustlers, being judge, jury, and executioner. So we have two firearms that are alleged to have belonged to Tom Horn. This one is kind of interesting. This is a Smith & Wesson double action break top revolver in 44 Russian caliber. And the sight has been replaced, the front sight has been replaced. It looks like half of an Indian head penny. We were sort of cold call. Somebody contacted the museum and said, I have this gun that belonged to Tom Horn. Would you like to have it for your collection? And we said, you bet. So the donor sent this and a bag of ammunition through the mail to the museum. And the story associated with the gun is that Tom Horn gave this to an attorney in Rock Springs, Wyoming, in lieu of paying for his defense. Well, maybe. They named the attorney, and I couldn't find any record of that person in Rock Springs. And Horn did have a defense team when he was on trial for killing 14-year-old Willie Nickel in Wyoming in 1902. And the name of that attorney was not on his defense team. So the gun could have been, it's of the correct era, that it would have been available to Horn. But I have found no documentation or indication. There's a couple of Winchester rifles that are alleged to be his. There's a revolver that is alleged to be his, but it's not this one. So since we're talking about Tom Horn, we also have a Colt single-action revolver that came with a really elaborate story about how it was owned by Tom Horn and then through this chain of ownership to end up with the donor. So again, a really elaborate story, very detailed, about people and places. But Horn was hanged in Cheyenne in November of 1903. This handgun, this Colt revolver, left the Colt factory in 1906. So, nope, that one was easy to disprove. This is a little Colt. It's a little Bulldog revolver. It's stamped on the top, British Bulldog. The British Bulldog revolver was actually invented or developed in England, and it was quite popular. It was not as expensive as your Colt single-action Armies or the Smith & Wesson revolvers that were available at the time. This is a 44 caliber, so it's significant, powerful handgun. It's very small, easily concealed, double action, and this one is quite good quality. Some of the ones that came out of Belgium, this is a Belgian gun because of the proof marks, but some of the guns that came out of Belgium were not very good quality. This one has very nice checkered walnut grips. The nickel plating is intact. There's a little bit of engraving around the screw heads, but this was claimed to be in the possession of a guy named Al Smith at the Hole-in-the-Wall fight in 1897, July of 1897. And the story about that fight is that 12 individuals representing various ranches led by a guy named Bob Devine, who was the foreman of the CY Ranch, which was owned by Joseph M. Carey, eventually governor of Wyoming, senator from Wyoming in the early days. So the story of this encounter is that these 12 men, including 2 Montana stock inspectors, went into the hole-in-the-wall area up near Casey, Wyoming, south of Sheridan, north of Casper. And they went in to do a roundup because they believed that people resident in that area had been accumulating cattle that possibly did not belong to them. So they're driving, the 12 guys are driving a herd of cattle through the hole in the wall with the intent of gathering more. They encounter 3 individuals, a guy named Al Smith, and a guy named Bob Smith, no blood relation, but a brother-in-law, and a guy named Bob Taylor. So, the people who win the gunfight get to write up how it happened, and Devine claimed that Al Smith started the fight by shooting at him and killing his horse. The gunfire then became general. Bob Taylor was fatally hit, died the next day. Bob Taylor. No, I can't remember for sure. One of the rustlers, alleged rustlers, was shot and killed. I think it was Bob Smith. Bob Taylor was taken into custody and delivered to law enforcement officials. Al Smith had a Colt revolver in his hand, and Joe LaForge in his book alleges that he was the person who shot the revolver out of Al Smith's hand. And we have a revolver in the collection and on display in the exhibit with a cracked grip that is alleged to be the one that was shot out of his hand. Now, the only provenance we have for this one is a claim by the donor. One person said Al Smith had this in his possession. It was claimed that this revolver and another one were stolen from the Al Smith house and eventually recovered. But again, it's impossible to say, is that a true story or not? No way to tell. There's no way to trace this. There's no way really to identify when it was manufactured, as we have with the other revolvers. Okay, this is a really easy one here. This is a really rusted old relic, and it's kind of cool. And again, the initial entry in our database said this belonged to Nate Champion because it was plowed up in front of the cabin in which he was killed in July of 1892 when 25 cattlemen and cowboys with 25 hired guns from Texas invaded Johnson County with a kill list of 70 people. They were going to kill the sheriff and his deputies, the county commissioners, a list of small ranchers and homesteaders that they thought were rustlers. So, as they progressed towards the town of Buffalo, where they intended to start their killing spree, they were informed that there were 2 guys on their list at the KC Ranch, again about halfway between Casper and Sheridan in Wyoming. And they spent almost a full day trying to root these 2 guys out, Nate Champion and Nick Ray. Ray was shot fatally very early in the encounter when he went out of the front door of that cabin. Nick Champion managed to hold them off until much later in the day when they finally set fire to the cabin. He exited out the back and was shot down and killed. During the encounter, a guy named Tisdale came by with his stepson, realized what was happening, beat feet to Buffalo, and allowed the sheriff of Buffalo, a guy named Red Angus, to mobilize a posse to go and meet the invaders. And they were successful in heading those guys off. The invaders took refuge at the TA Ranch and eventually had to be rescued by the cavalry from Fort McKinney. So anyway, the intake information says this was Nate Champion's gun. Excuse me, how in the world would you tell? It's also cataloged in as a .45 Colt, and it's clearly a .38-40. So it's just impossible that this revolver could have ever been traced to Nate Champion. There were over 50 armed people on the site. It could have belonged to any of them or none of them, but I really don't think it was Nate Champion's gun. So I mentioned Red Angus. There's another revolver that was initially in our collection. It was stolen from an exhibit in 1980 and alleged to have belonged to Red Angus. And he's a colorful character. Again, he was sheriff of Johnson County for one term at the time of the Johnson County invasion, 1892. The revolver has all the earmarks of an artillery model because it has mixed serial numbers, has a 5.5-inch barrel, it has a U.S. stamp on the frame. Those are pretty strong indicators that it was an artillery model. Starting in about 1893, the cavalry revolvers were recalled. At that time, the United States military had adopted a new revolver, a Colt double-action revolver and .38 caliber. So a bunch of these revolvers, about 7,000 of these cavalry revolvers with a 6-inch barrel, were brought back to the Springfield Armory. They were disassembled. If there were damaged or unacceptable parts, they were thrown away, discarded. But the cylinders all went in one tub, the barrels went in another, the frames in another, the other parts were scattered. So when they were reassembled without any regard to matching serial numbers. So I think that Red Angus gun was probably an artillery model at some point. There's another replaced part on it that doesn't quite fit. But anyway, those artillery models were not available for civilians until after the Philippine-American War ended in 1902. So obviously, Red Angus did not have that gun during the invasion. He could not have had that gun while he was the sheriff of Johnson County because he only served one term. And again, who's making that claim? There's no verifiable provenance. I mean, he could have had it. He could have acquired that gun after 1902, 1903, but we don't know that for sure. So another one, I don't have it with me because we were asked by a local individual to evaluate his firearm. And it was similar to this one, except it was a .22 caliber, and it had 10 charge holes in the cylinder. I'd never seen anything like that. But it was a very interesting gun. And the guy's story was that his great-grandfather, was a gunsmith and had acquired or modified that gun for a rather famous outlaw. So, okay. Looking at the gun, I didn't disassemble it. I'm very careful handling guns that don't belong to me or are not museum property. But disassembling it, he found some proof marks that were not used by Belgium to mark their firearms until 1895, which is 20 years after the alleged outlaw was shot and killed in Texas. So, did we do this one? I don't think we did this one, did we? This is a firearm. The original is on exhibit in the museum. This is almost identical to the one that's on exhibit. And the claim here by the donor was that this revolver was given to the grandfather by a sheriff of Weston County who was given the gun initially by the Wyoming Cattlemen's Association for suppression of rustlers. Well, we could identify and confirm the sheriff that was referred to. But the person that this firearm was passed on to, allegedly by that sheriff, by the time this revolver was manufactured, that guy was 70 years old and working at the boys' school, the reformatory in Worland, Wyoming. The other discrepancy is that there is really no such thing as the Wyoming Cattlemen's Association. It's probably referring to the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. and I've contacted them a couple of times over various questions. They have no records and no oral history, no indication that they ever handed out firearms to anybody. So again, as a historian, I feel an obligation, even when the news is disappointing to the family that the story that came down from great-grandfather probably is an exaggeration. I don't enjoy that part of it, and I'm very careful not to denigrate the ancestors or the story, but to say, okay, here's the facts. I have a little paste-up thing above my workstation above my computer that says the artifact does not lie. So we can look at the artifact and establish some verifiable facts and compare that to the stories that come down. So if you got any questions or comments, put them in the area here below. If you want to talk about guns or Wyoming history, you can call the main number at the museum, and they'll take a message and I'll get back to you. Thanks for watching.